The answers to all the kinds of questions that we usually ask from a clinical or a functional standpoint, meaning like, how does this actually affect my life? A lot of it can come down to and be predisposed by the tiny little defects or mutations that have occurred in our DNA. How do I know if intermittent fasting is going to work for me or if I should do it? Some people aren't going to benefit from the 80th percentile, like you should eat this way.
How can a person nurture themselves to help them perform their best, given if they are like the warrior type versus like the worrier type?
What you want to do is make sure that you can process dopamine effectively, because that's the downside, is that we're not processing dopamine and norepinephrine as quickly. It brings up the idea of nature versus nurture. And that's what a lot of fast COMT people will be really crappy at is.
Welcome to the podcast. I hope you guys are doing well. My name is Justin, and as always, I am here to bring you the latest and breaking news of how we can better ourselves and better the way that we function in the world. And today I have a really special guest with us. This is Dr. Jason Marr, naturopathic physician here in Vancouver, owner of Evoke. He's come on because I ran into a really interesting idea when my wife was purchasing a course in functional genetics, and she wanted to test herself and see what her genes said. And that got me thinking about what it is that I do as a coach, helping business owners reach their optimal best. And I reached out to my network and I found an amazing individual. I didn't think I'd find one so fast, but I found a really amazing individual in Dr. Jason Marr. And he's here today to share with us a little bit about what he does. And so before we get into it, I'm going to say hi, Jason, and hope you're doing well. And maybe introduce yourself a little bit more formally to the group here.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, Justin. It's a pleasure. I think I see a lot of sort of congruency around the kinds of people that we tend to be working with and for. And so it seems like a great opportunity to have a quick chat with you. But I'm a naturopathic doctor. I've been in practice for over 17 years now. I practice primarily out of downtown Vancouver. EvokeLife.co is our main clinic downtown. We've got a little satellite clinic out in Port Coquitlam as well. That I have a doc that runs for me. But yeah, this is stuff that I've been doing for almost 2 decades now. And, around functional genetics and what we refer to as precision medicine, this all kind of really started right around the time that I got out of med school. So for me, it's kind of been my whole career being enamored with and following the data and the research and the clinical data that we have around utilizing functional genetics to optimize our health and our brain function. So it's an exciting area of medicine for me and kind of like the pinnacle of personalized medicine right now, in my opinion. So happy to share whatever knowledge that I can about it. And that's a big part of what I do out of my clinic downtown.
Amazing. And so for people listening, what is functional genetics specifically? I think, people have this idea of what genetics is, but what is functional genetics and how does it apply to us?
Yeah, I mean, I was born in 1980, right? So when people my age, when we talk about genetics, it's like those genetic markers and tumor markers and stuff like that. And when we talk about genetics today, there are so many different sort of facets and areas of genetics that we've sort of specialized into. And functional genetics is about figuring out how recognizing that there are certain areas of our DNA that confer functional changes to how our body works. So if you go back to like old school, like way back to like elementary school and high school and stuff like that, you remember your DNA is a double helix, right? Double stranded helix. And if you can imagine that structure of your DNA and you've got those sort of ladder rungs that go across horizontally between those two strands, those represent a bond between two proteins that we call nucleotides. And those nucleotides we literally have designations for every single one of those ladder rungs. So millions and millions and millions of these across all of our chromosomes. And so there are obviously millions of these different pairs. And we now, since we've mapped the whole human genome, what is that, like over 20 years ago now, we know what we are expecting at every single one of those ladder rungs, what the pair is supposed to be for human function and for humans in general. The problem is that we also know that there are errors that can be made when DNA is copied. That happens actually quite frequently, and there are systems in place in our physiology to fix that and to clean that up. But every now and then we get pervasive changes. So these are referred to as, they're technically mutations in our DNA that become pervasive long-term in all of our cells in our DNA. And that gets passed on from generation to generation, of course, as well. And so right now, when we're recording this, in my opinion, there's probably around 150 of these. We call them single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, or just call them SNPs. but that these tiny little mutations at a specific spot on a specific chromosome, and if and when we see that error that's there, that's associated with functional changes in how our body relates to our environment, how we might process nutrients, how we might respond in certain circumstances or under certain types of stresses, for instance. And that's really what makes us unique. And so functional genetics is really about celebrating those differences and understanding that these tiny little changes, even if it's just a single nucleotide polymorphism, one tiny little piece, that can change how an enzyme functions. That could change how we respond to stress. That could change how we might process or absorb certain nutrients in our diet. So when it comes to asking questions about what kind of diet should I be eating, do I need to focus more on eating more protein, or do I need to be focusing more on eating low fat? Why am I not losing weight? Why do I have these tendencies to like ADHD types of symptoms, and with attention deficit or poor memory or burnout, etc.? The answers to all the kinds of questions that we usually ask from like a clinical or a functional standpoint, meaning like how does this actually affect my life? A lot of it can come down to and be predisposed by the tiny little defects or mutations that have occurred in our DNA, that have become part of us. So that's really what functional genetics is the study of these single nucleotide polymorphisms and related mutations, and how they can affect our function. And so from there, we've got this area of precision medicine that we refer to, and that's basically, creating personalized treatment recommendations, diet, lifestyle, supplements, medications, all those kinds of things, based on functional genetics and comprehensive blood work, typically. So that's sort of where we're at with personalized medicine right now. And so we have more than enough data these days to make clinical recommendations really across the board for diet and lifestyle supplements and medications, using DNA as a guiding blueprint or an instruction manual for how our body is built to function at its absolute best, especially in comparison to other people, so we can prioritize and leverage certain areas to the best of our ability.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for that brief introduction. my,
Mhm.
my question is now when we talk about SNPs and DNA, and when we're talking about the pairings, like I think of them as like alleles kind of deal where you have like a recessive trait and a dominant trait, and of course like those who are homozygous, meaning that they have one of each. Is that what the
Mhm.
same thing that we're kind of referring to in terms of the mutations, or is that something separate?
They're similar. The important thing to know about functional genetics is we are looking at these individual pairs, right? So normally we would expect, I'm not going to get too detailed here, but when you think about DNA, we probably most of us remember from high school, you've got pairs that go together, like A's and T's go together, C's and G's generally go together. And so we know generally what to expect at that level. So today we're going to talk a bit about the warrior gene, or warrior versus worrier gene. It's also known as COMT. Well, it's the gene that codes for the enzyme that we call COMT. And so at a specific spot in our DNA, it's called RS4680. That's the one SNP that we know correlates with these functional changes in this enzyme. We expect a certain pair of these nucleotides. And so if we've got a certain version of that, so one version might be a G, the other one might be a C, then we have an outcome that we expect from that and a functional level that we expect from that. So it's changes in those nucleotides that we're really looking at. If you've got two of the same, so a G and a G, we refer to that as homozygous, meaning the same. If it's one of each, we call that heterozygous. And you can also have homozygous with the opposite, or like we can argue that it's the defective or mutated version of that SNP as well.
So when we have like when we talk about like the weaker version of that, it's not necessarily a weaker version. Is there one that like they say that's the gold standard? Like you should have two like GGs instead of like say like two CC or yeah. I
Yeah,
think
great. That's a great question. It actually brings up a huge issue in functional genetics, and something that I have, I really feel like it's a big part of my platform when we talk about functional genetics. Functional genetics is about celebrating uniqueness. And I don't like how most labs and frankly, most doctors, when we talk about functional genetics, are suggesting that this is the good version or the bad version of this gene, right? If we're celebrating uniqueness and really understanding that some people just need this kind of environment to thrive, or some people need more of this particular nutrient in our diet, or some people, if we're going to supplement, need this form of B vitamins, then it's just a matter of being different and in recognizing where the priority or where the leverage point here is in our DNA. So I don't like it when we're referring to things as good or bad. But a lot of times, where this is coming from, the history around this is that, again, we've mapped the whole human genome. We know what to expect at this particular spot. And so oftentimes we'll refer to the wild form, meaning the most common, the expected form, as being normal or good. And oftentimes we refer to the mutation, the SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, that replacement of that particular nucleotide with a different one than we expect. That's the bad version. And it's bad because it's just historically different. But I think today, particularly in Canada, when we celebrate our diversity in our culture, I think we're talking a lot more about recognizing our differences and how that makes us special. And especially in medicine, I don't think there's been enough of that over the last several decades where we're really thinking about creating personalized recommendations and recognizing that some people aren't going to benefit from the 80th percentile, like you should eat this way, right? When someone says, actually, a good example would be coffee and caffeine. People ask me all the time when I do public speaking, is caffeine actually bad for me? And the answer is, unfortunately, it depends. Depends on your genetics, depends on how much you're consuming, depends on when you're consuming that, and how frequently. So there's a lot more than looking at food and food items and really medical and health decisions as being like the right or the wrong things. And so we need to get away from this dichotomy of good and bad and just thinking about like what's the whole balance here and thinking more holistically about how we apply DNA in this particular case, but in general, just how we think about, each person being different and celebrating that.
Yeah, and this I think is where I found the interest in how functional genetics ties into what I do as a coach. We talk about personal traits and habits, and people are like, you have good habits and bad habits. And I'm like, well, every habit has a good side and a bad side to it, right? I mean, if you're a
Mm,
people pleaser, you have good things about people pleasing and the bad things that happen to you because of people pleasing. Same thing as if you are egotistical, it protects you or defends you in certain environments, but also puts you at a detriment in being able to come across as arrogant or narcissistic. And so it's kind of like, well, you're just dealt the hand that you're dealt with, and you can, I mean, in functional genetics, you might not be able to change that, but you can foster an environment that is better for you to thrive in,
that's right.
knowing that
Yeah.
you have a, for lack of a better word, deficiency, right?
Mhm.
Or a maladaptation to the like the norm or the
Yeah.
expected norm, right?
Yeah. And it's important that you have that reference, like comparing that back to the norm, because what is the norm? That's just what's the most common outcome, what we expect and what we have, over the years decided that that's what we consider normal in our culture, right? But who's to say that that isn't, we can make an argument and you see like TV shows talking about mutants and mutations and stuff like that, and that's a mutation is part of evolution, right? And so I mean, I like using ADHD as a good example. We look at ADHD as a diagnosis or a label, and we label it as different and dysfunctional and not the same as the norm. But what if that's just the natural progression and evolution, whether we like it or not? I'm not saying it's good or bad, but that's just the way that our brains are working because of all the environmental triggers and stressors that we've applied to us, plus the likelihood of people and we're going to talk about this a little bit, the likelihood of people to have a warrior gene, the faster version of this particular enzyme that we're going to talk about today.
Awesome. And now, before we get into this, the meat and the potatoes of this, like the COMT gene,
Mhm.
you touched on something that's quite interesting. Is environmental factors. Now, we have genetic, predisposition. That's what you've got. It's whether that's a mutation or not. Um, but what is the role of environment? And we often refer to that as like epigenetics, if I'm correct, right?
That's one
How
way to
does
talk
that?
about it. Yeah.
Yeah, in some ways, so like environmental factors or cofactors that kind of either elicit the response or can influence the way that we function. Can you talk a little bit about that before we kind of get into the comp?
Yeah. I mean, epigenetics is technically a different area of genetics that we talk about, and it's how gene expression can be altered based on our environment. Generally speaking, it takes major traumas or long periods of exposure to trauma or changes or stresses in our environment to force genetic change in an epigenetic way, generally speaking. And so when we're talking about our functional genetics and these mutations, they have become pervasive in our DNA and they are being copied every single time your cells replicate. So like many several thousands of times every second, really. So they are pervasive. So it's not, we can't really, it's unlikely that if we looked up our DNA right now, we did a functional DNA test, and we saw a SNP that was existing there, it is extremely unlikely, near impossible that 20 years, 30 years, 40 years down the line, if I did another DNA test, that would be any different. Okay. So that expression, that genotype isn't changing. The phenotype that we often refer to, that's sort of like the physical expression or the outward expression of that, like what actually happens in our life, that's so dependent on all sorts of other factors and adaptations by our body physiologically that are not just dependent on one or two SNPs, but really the function of all sorts of genes. I love this discussion though, because it brings up the idea of like nature versus nurture, basically. Like that's essentially what we're talking about. And, I tell this story a lot, but I've got two kids, they're 10 and 6 right now. And when I talk to new parents in my practice, especially, and friends and colleagues who are having kids now, I tell people before I had kids, if you would ask me like what's the balance like nature versus nurture, I would have said like, oh, it's got to be like 80% nurture. I really feel like there's got to be some level of control first and foremost, and that's a bias for myself. But it's very much about your environment. How you develop and your how your brain develops, how your personality develops. And then I had kids. And then you see just like no matter what choices you give your kids, they have some sort of a predisposition that's built into them that they just gravitate towards those things. And I mean, we can talk about, not to get too deep into it, but like just as the most obvious example, just like gender roles, and for my kids and their mom and for myself, like really thinking about providing them with all the options and being very open to the stratification of gender roles and behavior. We're exposing my son at a young age to all sorts of toys and different things, including dolls and different colors, including pink and blue and green and yellow and all that. And my son, as an example, like stereotypically just gravitated towards diggers and construction vehicles and trucks and trains and planes. And then when we had my daughter, it was the complete opposite. We would give her all those toys that her brother had, and she had no interest in that stuff. And we would gravitate towards the dolls and pink stuff. And she's still like that now. She wears pink all the time. And no, not every kid is going to be like that. But the point of all of this was that, I, over the years, have really shifted my perception or understanding of that nature versus nurture argument, and it's at least 50% at this point. And certainly doesn't favor nurture any more than nature, in my opinion, at this point, especially now knowing what I know about functional genetics. So I think that you can't distinguish. I think it's very difficult for us to argue that we can distinguish behaviors or patterns that are specifically shaped by genetic predisposition versus those that are shaped by psychological development or experience, because it's always going to be a combination of both. And so it's a long-winded way of saying, yeah, I think the nature and nurture versus argument is really a 50-50 these days. And whether it's epigenetics or otherwise, it's just a matter of figuring out like what makes you a little bit different and unique, and what does your body, what does your brain need to thrive, like you put it earlier.
Yeah, and it's so important to. I think more so, I wanted to lay this out in advance before we talk to it, because everybody likes to talk in silos, and that this is
Mhm.
exactly what you're going to get. But remember that we're talking about like one gene out of hundreds, right,
Yeah,
of thousands of genes, and so
billions. Yeah,
the combination that you have is not standalone. And just like when we have a habit, just because you have this habit doesn't mean that the habit exists because of this one item. It's a
yeah.
whole host of factors that kind of play into one another. And yes, you have a predisposition for this, but you also have to look at all the factors. And so I wanted to make sure that we were clear about this, so when people are watching, it's like, well, I have this gene, I must be this and I must be that. And it's like, yes, you have a predisposition for that, but you have to factor in a lot of other variables. And that's why professionals like yourself and I, in the different realms that we work in, play a role in that and helping to distinguish on what is going to be a good environment for you to thrive at your best, and what modifications do we need to make based on your specific criterion to be more useful to where you are.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head right there. It's really important. When I review genetics with people, one of the first things that I'll say, usually the very first thing that I'll say, is we have to remember that functional genetics are not diagnostic. It is not saying that you have this predisposition even really necessarily, but it's not saying you have this disease. It's not labeling you with anything. It's saying you are, for instance, more likely to be vitamin D deficient, as an example. That doesn't mean you are, because if you're already taking 10,000 IUs of vitamin D every day right now, well, you're probably not going to be vitamin D deficient. So it depends on context and it depends on environment, right? Not and beyond that, you also mentioned, like, yeah, we're talking about one SNP amongst potentially millions and millions, many of which that we haven't really got a ton of research on. But we've got good data that correlates with predispositions for functional changes. For, as I said, in my opinion, the number is probably around 140, 150 spots right now. Most of the better tests will identify and analyze and provide data for about 130 to 140 of these SNPs, and it's variable depending on which lab you use, sort of what kind of information you get analyzed. But yeah, again, today we're going to talk about COMT or COMT, and it's one of the easiest ones to talk about for functional genetics because it's polarizing, for one thing, and it's interesting and it's fun, and it certainly relates to habit forming, and especially in the coaching environment, it's certainly something that makes a lot of sense to talk about. But it's also got to, when we do the assessment for this, it's not just COMT that we look at. We're also looking at other gene variants that are associated with dopamine breakdown and neurotransmitter breakdown, as well as the density of receptors for those neurotransmitters as well. So while we are going to generally isolate and talk about one SNP here, usually it's unlikely that there aren't going to be other factors that we already know about at this point that are going to have a role to play as well. So that's important to know. What I will say is the warrior gene, COMT, that we're going to talk about today, it has a very strong predisposition to the kinds of behaviors and outcomes that we'll mention today. And again, that's what makes it a fun and very cool SNP to look at, especially in our initial conversation here.
Yeah, so let's talk about COMT. So first off, what does COMT stand for, and what is it? What is it supposed to be, influencing in our body? And if you don't know, and you probably know this by heart, but it took me a long time to like say it properly. So
Yeah, it's a matter of pronouncing it is the hard part, right? But COMT stands for catechol O-methyltransferase, and that's why we call it COMT or COMT. And so COMT is actually, so this is the gene that when it is interpreted by your body, by your ribosomes, and you create proteins, it creates an enzyme. And that's the COMT is actually the enzyme that we're looking for as the outcome for this gene. And what its job is, this enzyme, its job is to break down neurotransmitters, essentially. It's involved in a number of different things, but the things that we probably think about it the most for are breaking down neurotransmitters that are related to pain. And so it's often referred to as the pain gene. And that's part of why it's called the warrior gene, because people who have the faster version of it, we'll get into this in more detail in a second, but if you've got the faster version of this gene, you generally experience or perceive lower levels of pain, and that's what allows you to be more of a warrior from a physical standpoint. Again, pros and cons, we'll come to that. But COMT as an enzyme breaks down dopamine, it breaks down epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are the pain ones. Dopamine is more of a reward structure neurotransmitter or hormone, as I'm sure most of your viewers will probably know at this point. So those are probably the most important things that we need to know about COMT in terms of its function. When we've got this version of, one version or another of this particular gene. COMT is also very highly involved in methylation, particularly when it comes to estrogen. So we probably won't get into that quite as much today, but COMT certainly has a role to play in methylation and estrogen metabolism. And therefore, when we're talking about especially women's health and predispositions to things like breast cancer and other estrogen-related cancers, COMT has to be part of that discussion as well. And so, again, not to get too far away from our topic for today, but it's just an example of where we think of a gene or an enzyme as having one function, but the ramifications of how that enzyme works can be far reaching into multiple different systems. And that's why, as a naturopathic doctor, as an integrative healthcare practitioner, we don't really remove one system or one process from the rest. We don't just look at the cardiovascular system. We don't just look at the endocrine system and hormones like estrogen and progesterone, but we also have to think about how those changes or differences in our DNA and in our functional genetics can also impact other parts of our health. So it's never just that's why as a naturopathic doctor, we kind of have to deal with the whole body and all the systems, even if we're focusing in on one area as a primary area that is of concern for our patient. But anyways, I'm going off topic a little bit, but COMT breaks down neurotransmitters, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine primarily, and others as well.
So if it's in the if it's used for breaking down pain chemicals and dopamine, which is like the reward chemical,
Mhm.
and it's involved in the speed. And if I remember right, it's involved in how rapid that breakdown occurs. When after your nerves or your adrenal glands have secreted that chemical norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. Why is that important in terms of the time that the molecule actually stays in that, between the synapse or between, the receptor,
Yeah.
and versus the time it breaks down? Why would we be so involved or in tuned with that particular piece of information?
Yeah, well, again, there's sort of two parts to this. Let's talk about the pain part first, because that's sort of the easier part. If you've got a fast version of the COMT gene, that'd be related to having two copies of the G allele, so GG, if you're looking at your own genetics there. And this is, sorry, I should also mention this is the particular SNP we're looking at is labeled as RS4680. For those of you who might know a little bit more about functional genetics, maybe you've got your raw text for your genetics out there. I'm not going to name any company names or anything like that, but if you've got your genetic raw data, then you can look this up, search for RS4680, and you can see what your result is there. If you've got two copies of the G allele, that's associated with the highest or fastest COMT activity. And so what that means is you're going to break down dopamine, or let's talk about the pain first. As I mentioned, you're going to break down adrenaline, norepinephrine. Noradrenaline is norepinephrine. But you'll break down norepinephrine more quickly than people who have the other versions of this particular enzyme. And what that usually means is you perceive pain for a shorter period of time and you perceive pain with lower intensity. And so that can be an advantage if you are in physical sports or if you have a physical job. So that's one of the ways that we can interpret this. Historically, when we were, hunter gatherers, this meant that people with this version of the gene would be able to push through physical stresses more aptly. They are more likely to be warriors. If we were going to war today, I would want to put someone in charge of different army units that would be fast COMT people because they are going to experience less pain, be less likely to be affected by, frankly, traumatic events and high stress. And this is where the dopamine piece comes in. So not only would they perceive less pain physically, but that's also pain psychologically as well. And that's where the dopamine piece comes in. When we're breaking down neurotransmitters very quickly, it means that our brains and our bodies function in a way that we typically thrive under pressure. So fast COMT gene 2 homozygous G COMT people generally thrive under pressure, and more than thrive under pressure, they need pressure to perform at their highest level. So when I do coaching for executive groups and I do functional genetic testing, this is one of my favorite genes to look at because we can now look at your executive team and say, hey, for the people who have the fast version of this gene, these are people you can push. You can put them under pressure. You can give them short timelines, and they're probably going to perform with you for you, and they're probably going to give you the best results when you do that. Give them more external motivation. Keep them very accountable through external means and extrinsic motivation, and you'll get the best out of them. The flip side of that for this fast COMT person though is they need time to recover as well. So this is more of a, it's more biphasic where, people like myself who have a fast COMT, we do a ton of work in a very short period of time. You probably are a fast test writer. You probably procrastinate a lot because you don't need to worry about doing things on an ongoing basis because you can pump out that project in about 2 hours tomorrow night before you go to sleep. And that's probably going to yield the best results. But I also need my downtime to recharge and to recover so that I can perform at my best for that short spurt of time. That's sort of an advantage, and one way that we look at how fast COMT, homozygous G COMT people will be predisposed to function at their best. And then we've got the opposite side of things that we can talk about in a moment here too. Does that sort of answer your question? I got all excited talking about it.
No, no, that is. I mean, and when we talk about having that psychological trigger, I mean, the brain doesn't really know the difference. I mean, a stress is a stress, and
Oh,
from a physiological standpoint. So whether that's a tiger chasing you or you're being bitten by the tiger, you're releasing the same chemicals, maybe just in a different format, or a
yeah.
different region. But I think that's the trigger. And so I guess my next question was going to lead into exactly that. Is like when we perceive that danger, that looming deadline, the pressure, and we rise to the pressure, those people who rise to the occasion, often are, we think of them as like battle ready and tested, and they're literally the warrior. Now, what happens is when those chemicals get released, if you had the slow version of that, like how does that affect you? And I understand it as at least what I've written so or read so far is that you stay in anxiety maybe a little bit longer. You set you know, more overwhelm in that regard. Can you talk a little bit more about what that might look like as a deficient end of it? In terms of not being able to clear
Yeah.
it as fast.
For sure, yeah. The faster version of COMT or the warrior gene is actually more highly associated with things like anxiety and depression. And that's because, as we understand it right now, most of those kinds of psychological disorders, as we like to label them, are due to neurotransmitter deficiencies. So if you've got a faster enzyme that breaks down those neurotransmitters, you're generally going to have less of those neurotransmitters around, which predisposes you to deficiency, right? So that means that you've got to make sure you're fueling your brain with the right kinds of fuel in order to produce those neurotransmitters more readily. And that's where it starts to get a little bit fuzzy because now we also need to look at genetic predispositions for how many receptor spots we have for those neurotransmitters. Without getting into that, though, the opposite side of things, so the slow version of COMT, there are, again, just like the first version, the warrior gene, we've got the warrior gene that's generally looked at as homozygous A alleles, so AA. Generally, that's associated with slower COMT activity. It means that you're probably not going to break down dopamine and norepinephrine as quickly. So from the pain side of things, you probably will perceive a little bit higher level of pain in terms of intensity, and it'll stick around for longer. And again, we're talking not just physical pain, but also psychologically as well. You're keeping neurotransmitters around. So what happens is that slower COMT people generally form better memories, especially long-term memories. And that can also be a positive and a negative because that will predisposition these people to higher rates of PTSD, for instance. So using that sort of war analogy, it's kind of an easy one to use because we can differentiate that, hey, people who have homozygous A COMT are more likely to experience PTSD in the long run from various traumatic events. But it's because they have a higher capacity for creating memories more vividly. So they'll experience memories more vividly as well. Because they keep those neurotransmitters around and because they experience higher levels of pain associated with them. From a productivity standpoint, because I know that's a big piece for you and your group and your followers. People who have the homozygous A or slow version of COMT, these are people in your workplace and around you that are going to give you a consistent effort where they are very predictable, where every day they're going to come in and give you the same level of effort, same level of productivity, and that is unlikely to waver very much if they are given a consistent environment. And so you don't want to stress these people though, because under pressure, under tight deadlines when shit really hits the fan. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on your podcast. Those are people who are more likely to freeze or to crack or to have decreased productivity. So again, people that we probably don't want leading a unit because they're less likely to be able to make clear decisions under high levels of pressure. But they are the kinds of people who are probably workaholics, who probably don't need their vacation time, and generally are going to be lower stress as long as they're not put into circumstances that are going to trigger high levels of stress. And if they are, it's going to be more troublesome for them in the long run. And that's again compared to your warrior fast version homozygous G COMT people. They will thrive under those conditions, but you need to give them time off to rest. Well, maybe not time off, but you need to give them lower intensity times in order to recover as well. So again, more biphasic for homozygous G fast version, more consistency for homozygous A slow COMT people.
Yeah, and it's funny because I mean, prior to genetic testing or functional genetic testing coming into my, sort of world, I would see these types of people as you described them, literally as you described them in the entrepreneur sector. Those people who are really true entrepreneurs, who really are go-getters, really must. I'm going to bet. I mean, I'd probably, if we took a look at it, that you'd find more of them who are be homozygous, GG, versus those who would be on the other end with the AA alleles, because the ability to handle stress and the variability of entrepreneurship, like the ability to stomach it, I think is what I see for those people who have great ability to work at high intensities, but they need that time to recover, and if they don't, they burn out really quick. Like
Yeah,
they just fall apart, and it's really interesting. But you know, I often say that if you have a person or your personality is like that, I mean, as a coach, if you know that that's your personality, that you actually should have a person who's the opposite of you, who is able to plug in at a very, steady rate. And they're the ones to kind of carry you through when you need the recoil. So this is really quite interesting that you bring it up that way. But I do see entrepreneurs, at least the ones that seem to thrive in that space, be there. The
mhm.
ones that kind of get overwhelmed are generally the people who are very need a lot of structure, need a lot of very sort of steady state work, and don't handle the big flux up and down. And I meet them from all walks of life. They want to be entrepreneurs, but they don't have the stomach for it. The variability is just too much for them, and it overwhelms them, puts them into paralysis. And
Yeah.
then the ones that who thrive on it, but they also they burn out quick if they're just overloaded and never give themselves a break.
Yeah. I mean, we also have to respect or recognize that, we are making some generalizations here, but you're absolutely right. Like entrepreneurship is a great example. And it's not just the variability in and the different responsibilities and tasks that you generally have to balance and juggle as an entrepreneur. But if you think of like the word entrepreneur, like it really means, this is the way I describe entrepreneurship for myself anyway. Generally speaking, an entrepreneur is someone who's really great at starting things and is really crappy at following through on things. And so you're a great ideas person, but it can be tougher sometimes to get down and dirty and do the ongoing, more monotonous tasks. So, like you said, it's about figuring out if even if it's a small company, but as big as your company might get, and as many different tasks as you might have, it's about figuring out the culture that you want and need in your business and your company, and figuring out how to put the most appropriate people into those positions where you need a certain personality type in some ways. So again, applying functional genetics to entrepreneurism and business and executive groups, this is some of the most fun things that I do. But the other thing about entrepreneurism that is important to recognize is that becoming a good entrepreneur, like how many times have you talked to or seen interviews of like high level entrepreneurs, all the famous people that you look at, and how they talk about, I've failed a bazillion times. And if you didn't have that short-term memory, right? If you had those failures seared into your brain and they hurt and they are emotionally traumatic for you and you carry that with you, you're a lot less likely to take those risks again in the future, right? But with a faster COMT, a homozygous COMT gene, you're less likely to remember as painfully your failures. And so it's kind of like, okay, that didn't work, next, right? Whereas a slower version of COMT is like, ooh, that's really a shot to my ego, right? So again, generalizations, but those patterns absolutely exist, and we see that across the board. And again, that's why COMT is such a fun one to play with and to talk with, because it's usually one of the first that I am able to predict with some level of accuracy without doing a genetic test, right? So it'll also be fun for your viewers and your listeners, because many of us who are watching this right now are probably thinking, oh, I'm probably a warrior gene, or I'm probably more of a worrier. So that can give us ideas about how we can put ourselves into a context or an environment that's going to be more conducive to our success, or look for jobs that are going to be more conducive to our success for that matter as well.
And so, kind of a side note, but not necessarily like two side. Now, we have where we're talking about, homozygous expressions, which is like, either GG or AA. What are those people who are heterozygous? Meaning, like, they may have one of each. Now, how does that affect? And then is that, I mean, while they say heterozygous, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that that would be the major, bell curve like all the time, is
Right.
it? Right.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. For a lot of functional genetics, there's often, I mean, there are stats for this in this particular gene, for this particular gene. Generally speaking, for each G allele, we break down dopamine twice as fast as the A allele. So if you've got two copies, that essentially correlates to 4 times faster breakdown of dopamine. That's sort of the stat that's out there. But what I'll tell you is, from a clinical standpoint, there's a lot of disagreement about the interpretation of the heterozygous version of the warrior gene. In my experience, people who have one copy of G, so are heterozygous, I still think of them as warrior gene, meaning faster, but it's probably not the fastest. So if we think of homozygous G being 100% function, let's say, or speed, then the heterozygous version of that is probably like 75 or 80% speed of breakdown of dopamine. And then you've got your homozygous A people, and that's probably like 20% of function. That's probably a better way to think about it. So I know, like, I use a lab right now where they will actually report from a psychological standpoint and a mental emotional standpoint that a heterozygous gene is associated with the warrior, as in like I worry a lot. And I don't agree with that, because in my experience, I've seen a lot more people who have heterozygous genetics here and exhibit much more of the warrior fast function here. Again, this is where it's even more important to then examine other genes that are associated with dopamine, and specifically the density of dopamine receptors in the brain. That's where it really affects our productivity level, and things like addictions and predispositions for mental emotional conditions. I hate using the word conditions or disorders, but things like anxiety, depression, ADHD, OCD, for that matter. These are the kinds of things that we often associate with fast COMT.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about like dopamine. I mean, dopamine is the reward chemical. That's what at least we know it for, right?
Mhm.
And we use dopamine, like, as a coach. I use the dopamine response to help amplify and solidify habit formation, because if you pair dopamine, like the pleasure center, while forming a habit, the habit forms faster and solidifies faster generally. So, can you tell or share with, like, your opinion on, like, how the slow version or the faster version of COMT may play a role in that? And what do you see in a clinical practice, in relation to the reward center, to habit formation and motivation?
Yeah, this is a great area of research, and especially, like you said, in coaching, is such an important thing to understand, and how we can relate to functional genetics. Um, if you've got the fast version, so let's call this warrior gene, homozygous G, you're breaking down dopamine very quickly. And because dopamine is essentially an addictive substance, we want more of it. And so it's more likely that you're going to want more of those pleasurable responses that you're getting, because you get a bit of a hit of something in this case. And that could be sugar, it could be an illicit substance, but it could also be just like a fun experience, right? And so when you get a little bit of a hit of that, you're like, ooh, that felt great. I really liked that. And then it quickly dissipates, and you're like, oh, I want more of that. And so you start to create situations or seek out those kinds of behaviors or seek out those kinds of substances that will provide for that hit again. Essentially, it is really an addictive process when it comes to dopamine. So fast breakdown or fast version of the COMT gene is going to lead to typically more addictive behaviors. That's definitely a predisposition. And that also means that it's more difficult for us to get motivation because because we get that pleasurable response and then it's gone. So then we want more and we try different things to do that. So typically it's going to be more difficult for people who have the fast version of COMT to develop habits more quickly. And it's because of that shortened pleasure response, essentially. You get an advantage though in that, again, that warrior strategy idea is like we process bad stimuli, aversive stimuli, we say, much more quickly. And so again, we're performing better under pressure, but we're not going to perform as well under low stress environments. Those are probably some of the key things there in terms of sort of like the habit forming side of things. On the other hand, if you've got a slow version and you're not breaking down dopamine very quickly, you're often going to struggle with, people call it paralysis by analysis, because it's like, oh, there's all these different things that I have to think about and that I remember, and I'm going to really, break down all of this into more detail. So making decisions is stressful for people who have slower COMT. My ex-wife was the slow version of COMT, and it was like so dramatically different how we made decisions and how quickly we made those decisions. Is the classic sort of male versus female stereotype of like, hey, where do you want to go for dinner? What do you want for dinner? Like, I don't know, whatever you want kind of thing. It's harder to make those decisions. So for people who have the slow version of COMT, um, things like various different decision-making frameworks can really come into play. That's where we can really utilize things like forced deadlines, which is a tough balance because if you force those deadlines too quickly, then that stresses them out and they freeze, paralysis by analysis. But we also sometimes can limit decisions to like multiple choice, for instance, and make them more binary. Um, and implementing deadlines to making decisions more quickly can sometimes be more efficient. But again, the balance there has to be with you can't stress this person out either. So that's the tougher thing about this. Fast COMT people are going to be more impulsive. They're going to make decisions more quickly. They're more action oriented. But because of that, they're probably not thinking a lot about second order effects or the consequences. Do you guys talk about second order effects? I love talking about second order effects. Like what
Yeah,
happens
absolutely.
do you make
Yeah.
a decision?
Yeah.
So fast COMT people are going to make more rash decisions more often. And so the flip side for them is when it comes to decision-making frameworks, it's actually slowing down that process and giving them frameworks to analyze and to think things through a little bit more, to overcome the likelihood that they're going to make a bad decision because they made it quickly, right? In our environment today, where we are predisposing people to social media and those micro hits of dopamine with like our reels and our stories and stuff like that on social media, like this is where we often start talking about like dopamine detoxes and dopamine resistance and stuff like that. But these are just some of the things that are associated with fast and slow COMT stuff in the workplace, especially.
Yeah. I mean, I've worked with people, I mean, obviously we don't know what their functional genetics test results would be, but I mean, I definitely see both sides of the coin in terms of the type of people I work with, especially in organizations where I may be working with the team. If the person who leads the team is always constantly moving at a really quick pace, and I mean, I have a client who is often we laugh about it because he runs so fast and he tries so many things, and he looks back, much later and realizes that like half the team is way behind them,
Mhm.
and completely lost and don't know where they go, and that environment is great for him but horrible for other people. And so when I coach them, I really try to lay the framework is like, well, you got to slow down and you got to map out a little bit, so that the people understand the breadcrumbs and the trail that you went on, so that when they catch up and meet you where you're at or close to where you're at, that you're not so far ahead that they can't figure it out, and that they're not so far behind that it drags you down, because the
Mm,
speed of which you want that hit is way bigger than the people who are just waiting for a paycheck, right?
mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so then, from that standpoint, how can a person nurture themselves, like through supplementation, through rest,
Mm.
through activity, to help them perform their best, given if they are like the warrior type versus like the worrier type?
Yeah. So let's talk about I mean, if we focus in on like diet and exercise and sleep, those are probably three areas that we can have an impact on that I can certainly give advice on that as more of a generalization here to a public audience. If you've got a slow version of COMT, you're probably what you want to do is make sure that you can process dopamine effectively, because that's the downside is that we're not processing dopamine and norepinephrine as quickly. So when it comes to slow or worrier versions of COMT, we probably want to do activities that help process excess dopamine. So more high intensity exercise can help break that down because it satisfies that need for dopamine. Fasting or intermittent fasting can be helpful for some of these people. Again, so many other genetic factors come into play here. That's another question I get all the time is like, how do I know if intermittent fasting is going to work for me or if I should do it or if I'm going to be able to do it? That's stuff that we can generally associate with functional genetics as well. Um, Structured to-do lists work really well for these people as well. So that's probably something to be mindful of. And slower COMT people probably already have good routine built in. These are people who generally are like 10:06 and I'm in bed and I'm gonna hit a wall at 10:06 if I'm still out of bed. Again, my ex-wife was like this. It literally that was the time. It was 10:06 and she'd be done. And it was every single night. But really good routine, and that will help to nurture things as well. And that's what a lot of fast COMT people will be really crappy at is they'll have very variable bedtimes. They won't have a lot of routine, and that's where they can benefit as well. Um, Other things like fast COMT, when you're breaking down dopamine and epinephrine, norepinephrine so quickly, we've got to fuel. We talked about this before. And because we're very fast thinkers, it usually means we're also not thinking about all the other things that need to be maintained on an ongoing basis. So we are faster COMT people generally are people who are like, oh, I forgot to eat lunch, or you know what? I generally just power through the day without thinking about lunch. And, by the time I think about lunch, it's like 4 o'clock. So I might as well just go home and have dinner. And that's not necessarily a good thing because it means we're usually deficient in protein and B vitamins and stuff like that. So a high protein or a protein rich diet is something that's really important for fast COMT people. And just making sure we're getting the calories, that's probably a really important thing there. It's more specifically around sleep, as I mentioned, though. Sleep routines are critical for both fast and slow metabolizers to maintain optimal cognitive function. And that's just because we thrive from routine for different reasons in this particular case, but routine sleep is going to nurture both forms or both speeds of our COMT paradigm.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to put it. I mean, when I do coaching, we have to look at so many different variables and patterns that already pre-exist. And I think one part of it is letting that person sort of detox and get out of what they perceive as a norm, to kind of get them to a baseline. Because what I notice is like there's some people who have a natural biorhythm to their day. Like myself, my circadian rhythm is like 9 o'clock, and I'm like ready to go to bed. And because of social pressures, or pressures from our spouses, like, oh, like the kids are down to sleep, and that's sort of like time for us to chat type of deal. But man, like I'm baked, I'm done at that hour. But I do that, just more so for a relationship building. But I think if we let people, be mindful of their baseline, we can start to see those patterns exist. And, when we do that, then we can look at, okay, well, if that's the way that you need to function, then we can build around that. And I think a lot of people now have pushed themselves too far out of touch of their own personal rhythms and preferences and abilities, that they become muddled because society and social media tells you have hustle culture and you got to do all this stuff, that they feel an obligation that if they're not like that, that they're not a top performer. And in fact, that actually could be hindering them from actually being a top performer because they're doing something that is contradictory to their total functional genetic predisposition.
Well, and it's also because we've defined what a high performer is supposed to look like, right? But high performance for you might look very different from what high performance means to me. And what I need in order to accomplish that for myself is going to be very different as well. The problem is in our, especially with social media, but in our culture right now, it's so dichotomous where we've said this things are either good or bad, right? I mean, today we're even just talking about fast and slow, and we're categorizing things as good or bad. And if you're not doing it this way, then that's not what being successful means, right? If you're not earning six figures, if you don't own your own home, if I mean the list goes on, right? There's all those societal pressures that we've defined as like what we think of as being successful. But what if being successful just means surviving? What if being successful means being able to just chill out in the backyard in my, in my home in the forest that is, 2 miles from anyone else's in existence? We really need to, recalibrate how we think of success as more individualized, and is just more attention grabbing with social media to say like, if you want to achieve these things and look at what this person's doing, it's all like keeping up with the Joneses. That's the biggest problem. That's the core of a lot of this, right? Is that we've defined what success means, in one way or another, for better and for worse. And so there's always that framework of comparing yourself to what you think success is supposed to look like. That's the underlying problem here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've worked with people who had this grandiose idea that they needed to build a big enterprise, but they're like 50 years old and they really don't like people. And I'm like, well, then why are you trying to build a large enterprise? It's like, because that's the definition of success. I'm like, to who? That's not the
Yeah.
definition of success for you, because you're nearing retirement and you want to lay on a beach. Building an empire beyond that, if you don't like managing people, really isn't a great option for you. That's not success. Success may be just more money coming in the door while you're on the beach, and maybe you should work to that as the thing that you really would like for your life, instead of what it seems like your entire agency looks like, and as from the outside in, right?
Yeah. 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 It's again, it's kind of setting out for your company, what the culture is that you want to see within that culture and what your ultimate goals are, right? So these days when we talk a lot about goal setting and coaching, there's a lot of talk about like finding your passion, right? And for some people, finding like that passion might be just, I get a hell of a kick out of just making money, like watching the money come into my bank account. That gives me dopamine. For like, we can't judge that part either, right? It's tough for us to we don't want to be hypocritical about people's goals either, right? If that's what people want, then that's what people want, and we shouldn't. It's difficult for us to sit here and judge that one way or another.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we probably could jam on like this forever, but I mean, there's got to be an
Sure.
end point at some point. But I mean, we talk about the way people perceive goals and, trying to manage themselves. If, and let me just kind of see if I understand this correctly. If we are a person who is predisposed to having a fast, you know, clearance of dopamine, when we act, I mean, we're moving at a blistering pace to the people below us. What are some things that we can maybe put some checkpoints in as an individual to make sure that we are not affecting those people who are maybe our subordinates,
Yeah.
who don't have that capacity? And I know you touched on it, but maybe something more specifically, or more
Yeah.
more bite sized,
Yeah.
for people to take away.
Yeah, feedback loops. If you are a fast COMT person, you need to checkpoints is a good word to use, and that means slowing down or pausing and asking for feedback, or creating processes for feedback in decision making in large groups. Like if you're on a board and let's say you're the chair of a board and you're making decisions and people are falling behind you in terms of the decision making process, we've got to have feedback loops put in place there. So that might mean shorter meetings with an evaluation process and feedback being provided to the chair here. Um, because fast COMT people, we like new stuff and we like having more new stuff all the time. It's shiny object syndrome, right? And it's immediate rewards. I want to implement something right now and I want to see what's going to happen. And then I'm going to evaluate that. And then I'm going to make a next action. Again, this comes back to the entrepreneurism thing, right? Like that's what entrepreneurism is often about. It's trying something, what worked, this didn't. I'm not really judging that or having an emotional reaction to that. I don't have any time for that because my dopamine's all gone. I want the next dopamine. So now I've got data. I'm going to make a decision from that. So being able to create short and shorter feedback loops is both relevant personally, but also within groups for fast COMT people. That's probably the most simple way that I can put it, is that we've got to create opportunities to stop and think on what's going on and why we're making this decision. And so short feedback loops, that's probably the biggest thing. And that goes for physical as well as mental, emotional, workplace interactions. You can apply that as a generalization across the board for fast COMT people.
Now, on the converse of that, and this is funny because I'm that type of person.
Yeah.
And I don't know my functional genetic testing yet, but I mean, I need change and I make change, but I know this, so I put feedback loops in for my team. But I have people that I coach who are the absolute opposite. Like they must be slower, they're more methodical. Um, when they're working with people and in their organization, they have fast moving people. What I see and what it manifests as is stubbornness, right? It's like it feels like they're stubbornness or really slow or really unable to move on to from a specific point in
Mhm.
conversation or in discussion or in decision making. How do those people overcome those hurdles when you're working with people who are faster?
First things first, it's important that we both recognize, and you called out that we're probably more fast COMT people, and so it's the lens through which we're looking at it, right? When we see slower COMT people, we're probably thinking like, oh man, like can't we go a little bit faster with that, right? At least for a short period of time, like let's just push it, right? That's what goes through my head is like just push it, like push the pace just a little bit, even for a short period of time, just get me through this. And so it's boring for us, but we have to recognize that that's not how everyone's perceiving that first and foremost. So now that we've called that out, what especially in small businesses led by faster COMT people, where it is like we want to push that pace, we have to recognize that the framework that we need to put in place for these slower COMT people is more of a consistent reward structure, so that we are reinforcing their behavior and celebrating that that is a positive for them to provide a constant level of output on an ongoing basis. That's something that I really, it's very important for me in my own workplace, knowing that there are some people who are very different from how I think. I've got to give them a lot more positive reinforcement on an ongoing basis to keep them motivated. Whereas a fast COMT person, I'll just give like a little bit of a pat on the butt and they're good to go because they're self-motivating, because they're always looking for that new hit. So for slower COMT people struggling with motivation, it means clear reward structures and more structure in general to their day, and positive reinforcement on an ongoing basis. And when they're not getting that, that's when those kinds of employees, especially, they will feel not just left behind, but underappreciated or unappreciated, because no one's saying, hey, great job doing your job on an ongoing basis. That's exactly what they've been asked to do. That's what's in their contract. But for fast COMT people, it's like, hey, we'll go above and beyond your contract sometimes, right? Do a little bit more. That's almost the expectation from a fast COMT person. So a slow COMT person they need to have that clear reward structure, have more structure in general, and get more positive feedback regularly. Otherwise, they're going to jump ship because they're like, well, I'm not appreciated here. I'll go somewhere else.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about that, what if your leader is the slow, and you have fast people in your organization? It means that you have to build in a part of your business to say like, take it and go, but bring back feedback to me, and knowing that like if you put your lens and leash on that COMT, fast COMT person, that you're possibly going to lose them for the organization because you're too slow for them. But maybe they're the ones that you need to put into the innovation department of your organization, where they can go and test things out quickly and bring in feedback loop for you in drips and drabs so that you can make decisions at a slower rate, but they're doing all that test work for you, because that might just be too much for you to handle, and too
Yeah.
much for you to stomach. And so empowering other people who have that ability to do that, and know that your requirements is that you need more input and you need more time to think things over, helps you manage the team that you're with.
Yeah. This
Yeah.
a lot of big tech companies are built like this, where you've got some people running the ship at the top of the ladder, so to speak, that are more organized and thoughtful and thinking long term, a little bit slower, but they recognize the need for the rate of innovation and for new ideas to be there, and so they will identify and categorize people into departments, or sometimes it's just like, hey, let's form a little group. You guys go and do your thing. And figure that out real fast, and then bring that idea back to us, and then we'll decide when and how to implement this at the larger scale. It's both a strength and a weakness of larger corporations, and especially larger tech companies. But that would be, from my position, like that's how I would look at it. If you are a business owner or a leader, of a number of different other employees or staff, and you are a slower COMT person and recognize that, identify that way, finding opportunities to um, give the right people the runway to go and do things for you at the pace that they feel is comfortable. That's a fantastic way to run a company, because then people can come up with these ideas and you can decide which ones to work with, and you can be thoughtful about that. But then people are driving that innovation very quickly, within their own groups, and it gives them a sense of accomplishment because they can work at the pace that they want with people that you're probably going to put them with that are like-minded and like alike in terms of speed of thought, and decision making. You then still need those checkpoints, though. So I don't know if most people are familiar in organizations with the idea of a red team, and so you might get these great ideas from this, compartmentalized, part of your board or this group, a focus group, let's call them. Bring that focus group back to present that idea, but then have another group assigned as red team so they can pick apart all those ideas and find the weaknesses. Because remember, fast thinking people sometimes make more mistakes, even if it was very efficient, right? So let's make sure we're not missing anything, I guess, is the important thing. So I love the red team exercise. So it's nice to be able to bring that into the picture too.
Yeah, that's such a fun exercise to do. And you can do that, and if you're an entrepreneur and you're a solopreneur specifically, more often than not, you don't have that capacity around you. You don't have subordinates or whatever, but you can have peers, like, be sort of that sounding board. And if you're, you know, looking for somebody who maybe has community coaching, or a what do they call those, a mastermind, where you're able to bring those things to the table and work out. I mean, you can be one, whether you can be the fast CompT or a slow CompT and still function in that sense, and get the most out of it if you know how to manage that. And I think that's one way that
Yeah.
people can do.
Yeah.
So yeah, so my final takeaways for today, I mean, and at least what I've learned so far, is that first off, genetics isn't our destiny. That's not like, we're not 100% like, you have this is exactly how you're going to play out. That, much like our habits and much like our own individuality, there are so many variables that play a role. And if you want to be hyper specific about those type of things, you need to look at a much wider breadth and picture of what your genetics are, or what your different habits in your environment and whatever, that play a role in that. And that's where somebody like yourself or myself, in our different areas of specialty, can help an individual. We can work with them, and we're working with what they're given, what their natural tendencies are, right? We're not there to change them, but we're trying to extract the best out of them. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I always talk about, like, especially from a genetic standpoint, it's about getting like a blueprint or an instruction manual for how your body and brain are designed to function at their best. And knowledge is power, right? So once you've got that data, it's up to you to decide how you want to leverage that. And that might look a little different from everybody, but it starts with just getting the data, right? That's how I look at it anyway.
Awesome. Now, if people want to know more about, the work that you do and learn more about functional genetic testing, where would they find you, and what would be the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, thanks for that. Appreciate it. Yeah, probably the best way to get a hold of me is just through social media, so specifically on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. I'm at Dr. J Marr, DrJMarr, on all those platforms. You can follow me and reach out to me there. And lots of content there for you guys to consume as well, around functional genetics and hormones and both men's and women's health as well. But I love working with burnt out entrepreneurs and business owners and stuff like that, young parents. That's really who I'm talking to on those platforms. So I would love to connect with you out there. Appreciate it.
Well, fantastic. And thanks for sharing. And yeah, I mean, he's such a great presence online, and it's really great to watch him. And I introduced my wife to him, and now she's enamored with him. So I got to be careful, can't let her come see you. She's gonna be like, oh my God. And but no, thank you so much for joining us and joining me here on the podcast and just getting an idea of what functional genetic testing is. And I mean, we have a list of other different genes that we want to explore here. So this is not going to be the last time that you're going to see Dr. Jason Marr here. I'm super interested in this, and I'd like to learn more. And he's such a wealth of knowledge here. So, but thank you so much for sharing your time and with me today, and sharing your knowledge with the people that we're going to be reaching.
Yeah, likewise. It's been a fun time and a pleasure, and looking forward to spending more time with you in the future, Justin.
Thank you.